The global cannabis market could reach $197.75 billion by 2028. And this is thanks to increasing legislation and its growing use for recreational applications. But that mainly reflects the story in the West. However, attitudes towards cannabis are also changing across the continent, and South Africa is leading the way. We'll tell you how on today's show. Also today, we stay in the continent's most industrialized economy, which could be hit with another devastating strike if negotiations between unions and employers in the automobile industry falls apart. We have the spokesperson of one of the industry unions with us today. This is Business Edge. I'm Cilo Cybin. Adila Balogun. Welcome. Let's get into the headlines. Zimbabwe's volatile currency, the Zim dollar, is showing signs of stabilizing with the gap between the official and parallel market exchange rates narrowing. Now, this is raising hopes that runaway inflation may soon cool. The government has unveiled a raft of measures since May, including a new interbank rate, gold coins, legalizing the use of the US dollar, and a brief ban on the bank lending to try and halt the decline of the value of the local unit that helped spur inflation to 285% in August. While the Zimbabwe dollar is the world's worst performing currency this year, slumping more than 80% against the greenback, the even larger collapse of its value on the street has reversed. The Nigerian government and the French Development Agency have signed a grant agreement of 25 million euros for the Northern Corridor project, funded jointly by the European Union and the AFD. Minister of State for Budget and National Planning and the AFD Country Director, Nigeria, jointly signed the agreement on behalf of their countries. Now, the Northern Corridor project, being implemented by the Transmission Company of Nigeria, is meant to strengthen low-carbon economic growth in West Africa by improving the quality of the electricity network in Nigeria and supporting the development of a regional electricity market under the West Africa Power Pool. Now to the eastern part of the continent, where the cost of fuel in Kenya has risen to a new record high after government partially removed subsidies that cushioned consumers from feeling the effects of the global hike in oil prices. Kenya's energy regulator said Wednesday night that it had removed the subsidy for super petrol while retaining a smaller subsidy for diesel and kerosene. In the new prices, super petrol, mostly used by private motorists, will now cost about 179 shillings a litre, up from 160 shillings, while diesel, which is used by transporters and industries, will cost 165 Kenya shillings in the capital, Nairobi. The Bank Serve Africa Economic Transactions Index, or BETI, which is an index measuring South African economic transactions, fell for a third successive month in August, suggesting that the economy is still struggling to gain broad-based momentum after contracting in the second quarter. BETI, which tracks interbank payments, dropped to 131.6 from a revised 134.2 in July. Severe power outages that were partly behind the economy shrinking 0.7% in the 3 months through June have also persisted. The Africa Export-Import Bank, the Pan-African Multilateral Trade Finance Institution, has set aside $6 million, around 6 billion Kenyan shillings, for the Special Economic Zones initiative in Kenya. According to the Afri Export Development Director, Oluranti Doherty, the money would be spent on setting up 2 industrial parks, Magweru and Matindi. And those are a few of the headlines we have for you at this moment. When we come back after this quick timeout, we get into our first conversation. Cannabis could be providing an interesting high for investors on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. The details after this. Now, marijuana was once one of the things parents warned their children about. It was an illegal drug, right up there with the worst of the narcotics. But times have changed, and so has the understanding of marijuana and cannabis. It is now legal in 48 countries around the world for medicinal purposes. In South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Rwanda, your doctor could prescribe you medical marijuana. And the transition from public enemy number one, or maybe somewhere on the list, to a panacea for a range of medical conditions, including nausea and pain, has generated quite the business opportunity. The size of the global marijuana market is projected to hit $51 billion by 2025. Now, Cilo Cybin, a cannabis-focused special acquisition company, will be the first of its kind to list on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Gabriel Theron, the company's CEO, joins me now to discuss the opportunity that cannabis presents for the continent. Gabriel, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
I know you probably get this question a lot, but for our viewers, let's also answer it. We're seeing a change in the attitudes and the narratives around medical cannabis, medical marijuana, even though we all use the terms interchangeably. But moving from somewhat of an illegal substance, something on the outside of the fringes of society, to now being a very viable business opportunity. What's driving that change?
I think the biggest drive behind it is if you go back a few years, probably about 80 years, before the big fight on drugs, cannabis was widely used as a medicinal product by doctors. And then after the big fight started on drugs, cannabis was basically outlawed. And it's quite funny that the plant was outlawed and not just the final product or the intentional of purpose of use. And what you've seen now in the past few years, starting with Canada and North America and a lot of other countries, like you mentioned, came on board and they're legalizing the product now. You can see that there's a lot of opportunity for this business to grow. If you look at the business, you also need to look at there's basically three avenues. You have cannabis that is used for medicinal use and for adult use, and then you have hemp, which is used in your commercial uses, and that industry is going to be massive.
And we can see that as an African woman, I can tell you how many products I've seen containing some form of hemp oil for hair. But let's quickly just give a bit of a distinction here. Many people will use cannabis and mean marijuana. Many people will say marijuana and mean cannabis. Are they one and the same? Because for the purposes of a legal, viable business, I think that distinction does need to be made.
Yes, and that was one of the first questions that I needed an answer for when I started this business. And I went to America, and at that point, the way they explained it to me was, it's exactly the same plant. Whether it's a cannabis or a hemp product, it's the same plant. The only difference is you measure a cannabis plant is the amount of THC, which is your psychoactive ingredient in the plant. If it's over a certain limit, it becomes a cannabis plant. If it's under a certain limit, it's called a hemp plant. But at the roots of it, it's the same plant.
Okay, at the root, it's the same. So let's come to South Africa now. Given the fact that your company is about to list on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, the first such company, a very historic move, it also means that there's some kind of structure and framework coming up in South Africa to legalize this. So take us through that. Are cannabis products fully legalized in South Africa? Or yet there's still some restrictions that may be in place for those who might consider getting into the kind of business you're in as well?
Okay, it's a long answer. So yes, it is still highly regulated in South Africa. It's not freely available for sale. Our regulator has opened up various channels in ways that the product can get to patients. It's still a very cumbersome process. The market is pivoted towards exports at this point in time. So government is pushing for export and that funds to flow back in. Where we are uniquely positioned is we are, as far as we know, we're still the only company on the continent that's got a cannabis cultivation license, a manufacturing license to export the oil into a raw material, or what you would call an active pharmaceutical ingredient. And then the last step, to take it all the way through to a final product that is ready for use in a pharmacy. So in our opinion, or as far as we know, we are still the only company on the continent that's got that can do all three of those steps. With regards to going onto the JSE, you can definitely see that there's a move and to open up this industry for not only the South African investors, but for all of the investors. We open it up globally, and the way we've done it is through a SPAC vehicle, which is a special purpose acquisitions company, and whereby the the public and the general public, as well as institutional investors, can come in the next 8 weeks, take up a stake in the company, and then from there we will go and acquire various assets in the space to literally supersize this business and become the extraction and manufacturing hub for the cannabis industry in Africa.
So it's interesting you chose a SPAC vehicle. When it comes to companies listing, people are typically aware of IPOs, initial public offerings, but why go the SPAC route in all of it? Because it really is not still so common in business.
Yes, SPACs are not very widely used in Africa, and they actually have a bad name overseas. And the reason why we picked this vehicle is quite for a couple of unique reasons. The first reason is, for us, because cannabis is a very new industry in South Africa and globally, the reason why we picked a SPAC was, in order for you to go onto the JSE, you need some revenues, and I think it's around about the $1 million per annum profit before you can go onto the JSE. Because it's a relatively new industry, we needed time to get to that point. The SPAC vehicle, on the other hand, does not require that. So that's a very quick way to go to market. And this industry is at the beginning of exploding, and we don't have the time to sit and build up organically, if I can call it that. We need to supersize and be ready for the business opportunities and to really take them. So that is the reason why we took this SPAC. It's the quickest way to market, to really be a competitor on a global scale.
All right, so this is a product. It's a plant that can, of course, be affected by weather, temperature, and all those things. So for those who might be interested in investing, whether it's in your company or other companies coming up, what do they need to know? Do they need to somehow become farmers to have a better understanding of how their investments will pan out? What do relatively new investors in this segment of the industry or the economy need to be aware of?
So I think the biggest pitfall that we've seen globally, because there's been so many companies going public, specifically North America, and they've dropped in price quite significantly. And I think the biggest mistake that an investor can make at this point in time is, when you speak cannabis, everybody thinks growing is the place to go, growing the actual plant. Where we took a very different approach to it and said, you know what, there's already over 80 licenses for medical cannabis issued in South Africa, yet there's only 3 companies that can further process that product into an oil, and there's only us that can go all the way to final product. So we are more focused on the extraction manufacturing side. So the first pitfall is, don't think when you think cannabis industry that you have to become a farmer to grow, because there is an oversupply on that side already, and the prices are going to come down globally. So first pitfall, don't think of cannabis as the growing side. Think about creating a brand, creating something that when I look at it 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, it's going to be just another commodity. And the guys that's going to be making the money is going to be the guys that built proper brands during this period in the startup phase.
All right, Gabriel, we're going to go on a break. When we come back, we'll look at the investor appetite. And then before we wrap up this conversation, what really are the opportunities in the cannabis industry, especially given the fact that many African countries will still be looking at it as an export commodity rather than for use in their own economies. So we'll pick up the trail of the conversation. The first cannabis company will be listing soon on the JSE. We have the CEO telling us about what opportunities cannabis could hold for Africa right after this. The global industry for cannabis could be worth around $198 billion by 2028. Could Africa get a share of that market? Well, that's one of the questions I'm putting to my guest today. Gabriel Theron is the CEO of Cilo Cybin, which is a cannabis-focused company that is now going to be listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. So, Gabriel, let's look at investors now. We talked a little bit about what people who want to invest should look for, but is there really an appetite right now for cannabis stock? What is it looking like?
Yes, I do believe there is quite significant appetite to get involved, and specifically on the African continent. We are the first in this space to go to market in this way. there's quite a significant amount of investment that went into this business on a private scale in South Africa and a few other countries in Africa. I do believe if you're asking in terms of can Africa play a role in the global cannabis market, I do believe we can. I think that in terms of the legislation, we need to speed that process up. And I also think that we need to look a little bit broader than just cannabis. We need to look at all plant-based medicines. And if you look at what's already been happening in Canada and North America, is that they are opening up various plant-based medicines and decriminalize and then in the process of descheduling those products. I think if South Africa wants to really become a player globally, that's what we need to do. We need to open up the regulatory environments and make trade easier. One of the key things that we also need to consider as Africa is that we need to also open up local market. The product is being used, and there's a report by New Frontier that they estimate the total use of cannabis globally is around about $400 billion a year, of which currently about $36.6 billion is legal. So that shows you that the product is already being used, and by legislating it in such a way that it is illegal to use, you're only depriving your own country from collecting taxes and to regulate the product so that you make sure that that product is actually a safe product to use.
And so you sort of lead me into my next question, which is in terms of the actual opportunities. As you said, you're looking right now at exports. A number of African countries, I know Morocco is also invested in this space, is also looking towards exports as well. What are the opportunities? Where are the countries that, if African countries are looking to build a cannabis market at least, they should be looking to penetrate in terms of what they produce?
So currently the biggest consumers in the legal space in cannabis is Europe as well as Australia, and South America is also starting to open up slightly. So North America is currently still closed. They are state locked, if I can call it that. So Africa's biggest markets currently today is Africa itself, Europe, Australia, and South America. So that is where the markets are currently today.
All right. So coming back to South Africa, it was earlier this year that the government said it would support local cannabis businesses. It would try to find a way to do something for them. Are we seeing any of that materialize now? Is that support coming forth?
It's in the process. The president did appoint a consultant in the space to advise on how to speed this up and to get this a more inclusive business to enter into. That process is undergoing or underway, and it is a slow process. I think a lot of countries, we need to find our feet. We need to, the regulators need to find their feet in terms of how are they going to regulate this in a safe manner. So it does take time, but you can see that there is definitely movement towards that.
Okay. And as the years go by, I shared some numbers. They said it will be $51 billion by 2025, possibly around $198 billion by 2028. And you can see the difference moving from double digits into triple digits in just about 3 years. What do you think really the potential for the cannabis market is for African countries?
Well, if you look at, like I mentioned earlier, according to the New Frontier publication, they estimate that the current global market, illegal and legal combined, is $400 billion. And that market is just going to grow. And the opportunity really is from the 36 billion, which is the current legal spent in the space, all the way up to 400 billion. That gap is the legal market. That's the opportunity gap, if I can call it that, where the legal market can claw into that market. And that is a growing market because cannabis got so much potential on the recreational side, but also on the medicinal side. And then if you go down the line on the hemp side, there's tons and tons and tons of business opportunities. So this is a massive industry, definitely one to be in.
All right, Gabriel, thank you so much for your time. Congratulations to your company for the listing. We'll be following how that plays out over the next few weeks and the kind of appetite and response you get from investors. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. And there are many, many opportunities with some of the best arable land around the world. Maybe cannabis could be a potential for African countries, but that also requires a change of thinking and a change of attempt and direction when it comes to the issues around cannabis? Is it just for exports, or can we also make money from it ourselves? Questions that regulators and governments will have to contend with in the coming years. You're watching Business Edge. When we come back, it's business from the international side. Stay with us.